Testing. 1, 2. Okay. Hey, Reels Tanks. Welcome to the stream. Is the sound alright? Sound and video check. Hey, Cobwebs Caverns. Welcome to the stream. You guys give me a sound check. Thank you, Reels Tanks. So we're on broadcast number 9. Number 9. Hey, Laura, welcome to the stream. And I've switched to stocking. And by stocking, I mean what we put in our tanks and the research that's necessary for people that are new to the fish keeping hobby to do before they put fish in their tank. And there's a lot of different. Terry's Tropical Tanks is cool. This is way better than watching fish tubers film fish tubers at Aquashella. Well, I would probably advise you to go watch fish tubers film fish tubers at Aquashella. That's a place I wish I was right now, but it just wasn't in the cards this year. I pretty much blew out my, hey Justin Shepard, I pretty much blew out my fish budget last year, so I didn't go to Aquashella. But anyway, what I'd like to talk about today is the stocking that goes on in new fish keepers. Cobwebs Cavern says golden rule number 1 for anyone wanting to get their first fish: don't buy a goldfish. Well, Cobwebs Caverns, I think you know as well as I do that a lot of people that take their kids with them to the pet store to get dog food and are suddenly faced with a child that is desperately wanting a fish. Most of the time those are goldfish and they go in bowls, and a lot of times they are promptly killed by overfeeding or lack of understanding of water conditions and the care that water conditions require. So a lot of goldfish get bought by new fish keepers that are just trying to please a child and to make a child happy. And a lot of people get by buying a single comet goldfish, and if it happens to die, they go buy a new one and put it in the bowl to keep their child happy. And a lot of times that goldfish dies too, and the child loses interest, and the fish keeping hobby is no more for those people. And I really feel like it's incumbent on us as better fish keepers to offer those new people that in the couple of weeks that goldfish lived, fell in love with watching a fish in a tank or a bowl and decided to join us in this mass delusion, this pastime, as Heinz called it, this hobby of fish keeping. Hey, Corona Ken, welcome to the stream, man. Anyway, yep, a lot of people win goldfish at a fair too. Cobwebs Cavern says they are one of the worst candidates for a starter fish in a small tank. White clouds make a better choice for a small tank, and I would agree with that. I think it's while goldfish have some good sides to them in the sense that they're cold water fish, and new fish keepers that just buy And Laura says what's worse is being able to win a goldfish at the fair. Yep. And then you got to try to keep it alive. Um, but goldfish are cold water fish, so they don't really require um, a heater and a lot of the accoutrement that more expensive and more advanced fish require. Um, I would say white clouds are a better choice for a goldfish bowl or a small first-timer goldfish tank. And there are a lot of other candidates that are probably uh, much, much better choices to give someone a chance to actually start out fish keeping and have some success and learn to love the hobby and learn to start advancing in the hobby. Um, one of the golden rules of fish keeping is also that they say an inch per gallon. And an inch per gallon works well with fish under 2 or 3 inches long. They they will survive in smaller tanks. Hey HC Aqua, welcome to the stream. But when you get into larger fish, cichlids, larger cichlid species, some of the larger catfish, even the common pleco will go 20 inches full grown. Cobweb Cavern says platies are a much better starter fish as well. What's not to love about a temperate live bearer? And I think that's another good choice for stocking a first timer's tank. And they're pretty, they're colorful, and they breed readily as long as they're in a semi-functional situation in the tank. Platies will do well. Swordtails, guppies. There are a lot of different types of small fish that are very colorful and will serve much better than a goldfish will in a tank. But goldfish are really cheap. They're brightly colored. Children see them and fall in love with them and so want them. Did anyone see Rob do the longest wave ever? I personally did not, so you probably have to clue me in. The 1 inch per gallon rule is okay. It's kind of a semi-functional rule, but anytime you start getting into larger cichlids or larger fish, fish that go over 5, 6, 7 inches in length, you need to start recognizing that larger fish require a tank that they are able to turn around in. Oh, the line at Aquashella. Yeah, I can imagine. Dallas is a big town, so there are a lot of people. A lot of people are probably going to spend their Saturday mornings at Aquashella. So if you buy, you accidentally buy a doveye, accidentally in the sense that you don't really know what you're buying, but you just love the way that little fish looks. If you accidentally bring home a fish that gets very much larger than 5 or 6 inches, then you probably need to think about what size that fish will get to when it's full grown. And you need to understand that your tank needs to be wide enough for that fish to be able to turn around without curling itself up in a ball. you need to understand that that tank needs to be long enough that that fish can swim easily from one end of the tank to the other and have room to swim so that it's not just basically turning around and butting its nose on the other end of the tank. So this is where the research comes in. This is where the recognition of being able to look at good research and find out how large this fish will get in an aquarium, so that you understand whether you're buying a tank buster or a monster fish before you take it home and try to keep it alive in your 10-gallon. Now that 10-gallon tank may very well be just fine to keep that fish in for 4 or 5 months, maybe even a year, but you really need to watch and understand beforehand, either by asking people at the fish store how large they get, or by asking people that you know how large they get that keep fish. And people will generally give you a decent idea of what to expect out of fish. There are a lot of fish that we put in our tanks that get very large. Those cute little red-tailed catfish that you find for $10 at the store, they're gorgeous. They have beautiful white markings on a black body with a bright red finnage, and they are cute and personable, but they can end up being monsters when they're full grown. 500-gallon tank might be too small for them. And those are the kinds of things. I mean, you can always take a fish like that back to the store and turn it in, or call up Big Rich at Ohio Fish Rescue and tell him you've got another red-tailed catfish for him. There are ways to deal with fish that grow too large or fish that are too aggressive. If you suddenly find yourself in a situation where you cannot any longer care for that fish, the one thing that you should never do, and we as fish keepers need desperately to understand this and to make clear to anyone that is in the hobby with us that this is not acceptable. You should never release an aquarium fish into the wild. Now, if you've got a little pond on your property and you can very easily make sure that no one catches out of that pond and carries off and is going to release somewhere else, then maybe you could get away with it. You know, if you've got a crappie pond of several thousand gallons, then maybe you could put your red-tailed catfish in there. Of course, red-tailed catfish are not going to do well in colder environments, so it's probably not going to live that long if you live in the northern parts of the United States or in places where the weather gets really cold in the wintertime. That fish is probably going to die, but you never know. They've survived in places where you wouldn't think they would survive. But we should never release our fish that we have bought in the hobby that come from all over the world into a wild environment where we live, because those fish may be able to outbreed and outcompete local endemic species and kill them all. There are literally places in Florida where native species no longer exist because tilapia farmers have had fish get away from them. And Terry's... Yeah, hang on. Terry's Tropical Tank says a red-tailed catfish was caught in Lake Michigan in a warm water powerhouse discharge. Yeah, that's exactly life will find a way. Hey, Dank Tanks, welcome to the stream. We're just yammering on about stocking in new hobbyist tanks. So if you've got any tips to give them, please in the chat do so, and we'll talk about them. What did you want, honey?
I just read yesterday about snakeheads in northern Japan, the islands way up in northern Japan where nobody thought they could live, and they had gotten so big and were so voracious that they were eating this kind of carp that the Japanese think are precious, and they use them, you know, to breed to make fancy fish, and the snakeheads were eating their carp, their precious carp.
Yeah, so anytime you as a fish keeper, and this goes for the new fish keepers, you should never release non-native species into our wild environments, because they will invariably find a way to survive and strip the native species out of the waterways where those fish have been released. And it seems kind of harmless. You just don't think one fish would be that big of a deal, but they are that big of a deal. They managed somehow to find another of their species or of a similar species, and they start breeding, and pretty soon that's all there is left in that waterway. All the native species are dead. And the same thing goes for other places in the world too. They bring in tilapia to clean up algae or something like that, or as a food fish, to farm for food fish, and they escape the pens where they're held and get into the local waterways, and pretty soon there's nothing left in those local waterways but tilapia, because they breed so quickly and just overpower native populations. Tilapia will, the young of tilapia, if two fish, if a cichlid, a regular cichlid, and a native species and a tilapia both breed at the same time, the tilapia eggs will develop way faster. The fry will grow way faster until they're literally able to eat the fry of the cichlid, because they've outgrown them so quickly. They will outcompete them for food. They will eat everything. There will be nothing left for the native species to survive on. And yeah, they do a great job of feeding mass populations, but they just outbreed everything in sight. So that's just part of the research and the responsibility that's incumbent on us as fish keepers and as new fish keepers. It's just a hobby that requires you to do some research. It requires you to spend some time reading, to spend some time on the internet looking things up, listening to other fish keepers on FishTube, or going to a website of one of the various species or a seller's website. There is a lot of information out there. If you try even a little bit on the internet, you are going to find a deluge of information. It's incumbent on you to learn to pick through that information and figure out what is true and what is not true, or what was anecdotally true for one person but won't work in your situation. So we can spend some time. HC Aqua says in some of our waterways all you see is tilapia. And once that gets into the native population, it's almost impossible to get it out of the native population. And they will spread like wildfire. They'll take over whole entire waterways, get into major river systems, take over other waterways. They are just an invasive species. And the the fish that are at risk are native species. You know, we in the United States really aren't supposed to keep too many of our native species. There's all kinds of rules and regulations about what we should keep. Terry's Tropical Tank says, I'll be back. Going to buy some fish. Yeehaw. I know that feeling. Do your research, Terry. I mean, in this day and age that we live in, you can take your cell phone with you to the fish store, and you can literally research something you find in a tank on the spot with your cell phone. Just Google the name of it. Just Google the Latin species name of it. And you can literally do enough research in the store on your phone to figure out whether this is a fish that's either right for your tank size, right for your tank water parameters, or right for you to keep. You know, I mean, one of the things we haven't really talked about here is aggression. There are a lot of very tiny fish that are highly aggressive when they're put in a tank with other fish. They may be aggressive towards their own species. If you buy 6 of something, 2 of them may pair off and try to kill the other 4. It's entirely possible. And it's going to happen if the tank is not large enough for those fish to have lots of hiding spaces in. And it may happen anyway just because of how aggressive the species is or how aggressive the individual fish is. It is possible to get non-aggressive species and end up with a particularly aggressive individual of a normally non-aggressive species that will go on a tear and try to kill everything in the tank. You can buy certain types of fish, like an electric eel, that are naturally going to kill everything in the tank with them because they're either going to be frightened or aggressive and shock and kill everything in the tank. You could buy a chaka chaka catfish that's going to release enzymes from its stomach that will wildly vary the pH in the tank, mostly drop it to highly acidic, and it can kill everything in the tank with it. Yeah, and Cobweb Caverns has given us a great example. Cribensis. This is a small, beautiful cichlid from Africa, and it's not one of the Rift Lake species. It's from river systems, and they are gorgeous, and yet they are very aggressive on occasion. Most of the time they're not terribly aggressive. You know, usually you can get 3 or 4 and get a pair and things will go along nicely. They'll fight each other, but they're not trying to kill each other. But occasionally, and in some species, you will end up with a particularly aggressive specimen, and it can easily try to kill everything in the tank, including its mate. Hey, Lumpy Dog, welcome to the stream, man. So, it's, you know, you get into the fish keeping hobby, you find a tetra that you just love. Those tetras they're really rare, and they end up costing you $5 a piece. and you buy 20 of them, and you've got $100 worth of tetras in your tank, and they're doing fine, and you buy a small little fish that just looks beautiful to you. Hey, Lumpy Dog. Um, and hey, Phil Emerson, welcome. Um, you take that small, shy, innocent, beautiful fish home and put it in your tank, and the next morning you get up and 5 of your $5 a pop tetras are missing, and you don't see them anywhere. And the next morning you get up and 6 more are missing, and this time you can still see that 3 tails are sticking out of the mouth of that small, shy, beautiful, unaggressive fish that you bought at the pet store. You need to do your research to save yourself money. Literally save yourself money, because some species in this hobby can be ridiculously expensive if they're new species, if they're new to the hobby, if they're very difficult to breed in home aquarium, if they've had to be wild caught to even exist in the hobby for sale. You can spend a lot of money on a fish and end up having a very inexpensive fish kill all of them, or try to kill all of them, if you have not done your research about your stocking. And my personal place that I have gotten to in this hobby is that I really try my best to take fish from a certain area and keep them with other fish from that area. Because one of the things that we learn, or that I feel like I have learned, I can't speak for everyone, is that fish communicate to each other. Large, aggressive, or territorial fish will communicate to the other fish in the tank that they're encroaching on what they see as their territory. They've claimed this territory. And fish that are not from the same region may not understand those warning signs, the displays, the behaviors, the way of swimming back and forth over a spot that a lot of fish are using to communicate to the other fish in the tank that they have claimed this spot and do not come here or I will try to kill you. And so you end up with unnecessary deaths in the tank because the platies didn't really understand that that particularly aggressive convict cichlid meant business about don't come into my area because I'm going to lay eggs here with my mate and I'll kill you if you come around. And so it's just in my personal experience, hey, down the wormhole, welcome to the stream. I have reached a place where I prefer, and this doesn't mean that you can't keep wildly varying community tanks. People do it every day, all the time, and it is possible to do those. But it has been my experience that if you are keeping fish that are even slightly aggressive while breeding, or just aggressive by nature, that you need to be very careful about what fish you put in the tank with them, and you need to be very careful about how large the tank is to give those other fish ample hiding spots where they can retreat to. And think about it. If a fish normally swims around in the top water all of its life and rarely goes deep into the pond or the lake or the river, and you suddenly put it in with a fish that the only way that it can get away is to burrow into a tiny crevice under a bunch of rocks, and that's the only place that it can survive, and that it continually has to retreat back to that spot over and over, then you are not going to have a thriving fish on your hands. It's going to be stressed. It's going to be continuously in fear of its life. It's not going to show you its normal coloration or its normal behaviors because you have placed that fish in a situation where where it can no longer thrive. And those are the kinds of things that we need to do research on. We need to talk to our fellow fish keepers. You know, if you've got a buddy that's been in fish keeping forever and you bring him in to look at your tanks and he says, uh-oh, you're going to have to fix this. You're going to have to put this fish somewhere else, or you're going to have to put these fish somewhere else. That's a person that knows already that you have got a very aggressive fish in with very non-aggressive fish that are not going to be happy in their situation. And this is not even something that you can always see coming, because it is very possible to go to the pet store and buy a Siamese algae eater, which is a notoriously non-aggressive species that mainly cleans algae and hair algae out of tanks. And that's what people buy them for. And they're little tiny when you buy them from the store. And put it in a tank and have everything be just copacetic for maybe 6 or 8 months or a year even. And then suddenly it becomes apparent that you did not buy a Siamese algae eater. What you bought was a flying fox. And they look very similar and are sold as each other a lot of the time. But that flying fox, when it gets to be 3 or 4 inches long, it is no longer going to worry about eating algae in the tank. It's going to start attacking every other fish in that tank. And by then they're usually larger than a lot of the tetras and a lot of the little fish that they were kept with in the beginning. And that fish may very well kill everything in the tank around it. And because you were sold something under one name doesn't mean that that's what it is. And this is where observation comes in handy, because you will, if you really observe that fish closely and watch how it grows and what its markings morph into as it grows older, you may very well spot that this is not a Siamese algae eater. This is a flying fox or one of the other species that get very aggressive when they reach slight maturity. Once they grow past the stage of worrying about eating algae, they're going to eat the slime coats off of other fish, or they're going to try to eat the tail fins off of other fish. And you're going to end up with a tank full of dead fish and one flying fox. So this is why research is so critical in stocking, is that you need to know what you've stocked your tank with. You need to know what those species are like, how those species behave, how the individual specific fish that you have gotten behaves and what it is like. And then you can begin to decipher whether you've set up a disaster waiting to happen, or whether your situation is probably going to be okay, or whether this is a situation that you need to continuously monitor and watch all your other fish very closely to make sure that you don't see fins missing or missing fish. You know, because if you've got 30 tetras in a tank, it may be difficult to notice that one of those tetras has been harassed to death and is dead in a corner of the tank where you can't see it. Maybe the fish that was harassing it was trying to get it and pushed it underneath a corner of a rock or inside of a tank decoration, and suddenly you've got an ammonia problem in your tank. And if your tank is overstocked, that ammonia problem will cause worse problems to happen in a cascade. So you need to try your best to not put fish in a situation where one aggressive species is going to try to kill all the other fish and perhaps knock off one of your tetras, your beautiful school of bloodfin tetras, and one of them ends up dead and you can't really notice that it's dead because there were so many in that school. You've created a situation where you could be creating problems. Phil says, I've been reading through Keeping and Breeding Aquarium Fishes by C. W. Emmons, 1953. Very informative reference material. I'm not bringing that book up in my memory right away, and I don't recognize C.W. Emmons, but that does not mean that that's not a very good book. And you are saying, hey, Big E's, welcome to the stream. And you are saying that it's a very informative reference material. And that echoes my thoughts entirely, that even books that were published in the 40s and the 50s still have valuable kernels of knowledge in them and may very well have knowledge that is lost in the modern fish keeping hobby. You may find something in one of those older volumes that is fundamentally profound for your situation, and you have not seen it everywhere. HC Aqua says, I'm not going to lie. If Cardinal Tetras took over one of my local rivers, I wouldn't be mad. As bad as that is, well, it's not usually fish like Cardinal Tetras. But if you lived in South America and those Cardinal Tetras took over a river and outcompeted an even more rare and more valuable fish, then even in that situation, it would be an invasive species killing off an endemic population that might not exist anywhere else in the world. Hey, Aquarium Cobb, welcome to the stream. Phil had the comment, sounds just like humans, and yes, very much so. Although humans are a little more complex, their water parameters are a lot different too. So I'm just trying to gloss over all these areas. I mean, there's no way in a couple of live streams, hour-long live streams, that I'm going to cover in depth what every new fish keeper needs to know. And I can't do hand-holding in these live streams because every instance will require the exact parameters and situations in the tank that is the source of the problem for each individual fish keeper. So there's no way I can tell all fish keepers what to do in this situation because I don't know the particulars about the situation and I don't know what really is required or what's causing the problem. You know, there are a lot of different things that can cause problem for people's stocking and fish tanks. There are a lot of different, one of the rules, one of the quote golden rules that all fish keepers should follow is quarantine procedure. But even quarantine procedure of a month or 2 months is not always enough to completely proof those fish from passing on a disease to the fish that you've already got in your main tank that those quarantined fish are bound for. Um, a lot of people, Diana Wallstead is one, recommend the canary system, and there are various forms of it, but usually what this requires is for after a certain period of quarantine in a tank, take one or two of your expensive fish that are already in your tank, the tank where these fish are destined to live, and put those two fish from that group out of the tank. Curly Bunny, EMT, hi Dwayne and all at the hospital, just saying hello. Well, welcome to the stream. I hope things go well at the hospital. I hope you're just working there instead of having to be there for a situation. The canary method allows you to determine whether the fish you already have in your tank will be able to survive with the fish in the quarantine system, or whether there is some form of disease that those quarantined fish naturally are resistant to, but yet carry and could pass on to your fish in your established tank. And by taking a couple of those established fish and putting them in with the quarantined fish and letting them go another 30 days like that, you will be able to observe your established fish and see if they develop some disease. Because fish come from different environments. Hey, Jay in Aquarium, welcome to the stream. Fish come in from different environments, different pHs, different TDSs, different water temperatures, and all of those things can lead to certain pathogens, certain viruses, certain diseases, certain parasites that will live in those environments, and those fish develop a certain amount of resistance to those things. They carry them, they're in their bodies, but as long as they're healthy, those pathogens do not overtake their body systems. But the fish that you have in your established system may not be able to have developed resistance to whatever it is, a virus, a parasite, a pathogen of some sort. And because of that, when they're put in with those fish, or those fish are put in with them, suddenly those established fish have no resistance to a disease that the quarantined fish are carrying but have high resistance to, and your established fish immediately get that disease because they have never had the opportunity to be resistant to that pathogen, whatever it may be. So that's just another one of the things that we need to be aware of as fish keepers, to understand our stocking. Stocking can be one of the most complex issues. It doesn't seem like it. It seems like all you do is go and see a fish you like and buy it and bring it home and throw it in your tank with all your other fish that you like, and everything's going to be perfect. Sometimes that's how it works out. Sometimes, by the luck of the draw, you get a fish that will go with all these other non-biotope species that you've assembled in your community tank, and sometimes you get lucky and that things work out perfectly. But that's not to say that you should expect that every time. Hey, Dan Slee, welcome to the stream. Um, it's smarter to do the research beforehand and to do quarantining and to even in some cases do the canary method so that you see whether those fish are going to infect fish from your established community. Because it's a lot better to lose 2 fish and understand that you should not put those quarantined fish in with your established community without expecting to lose the whole tank or many of the fish in the tank. And that's not anybody's fault. That's just nature. It's just how it is. We just need to be aware of those kinds of potential possibilities. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. It just means that it's really bad to have 100 gallons of water in your house with 50 fish that you have just dearly fallen in love with, and you go to the big box store to pick up dog food and spot a contaminant in one of their tanks and just cannot pass that contaminant up, and you bring it home and without thinking you just plop and drop it into your 100-gallon tank full of gorgeous and expensive fish, and within a month most of all of them are dead. And it's because you failed to do a quarantine. HC Aqua, I'm here to tell you from experience that sooner or later not quarantining your new purchases will bite you in the butt. And it's just how bad it's going to be. Doesn't mean that you can't be observant and spot what's going on quickly and treat it appropriately and save all your fish. You can very well do that if you are a good fish keeper and know what you're looking for. But fish keepers invariably find themselves in terrible situations because they have not quarantined. And that does not guarantee, quarantining will not guarantee that you aren't going to introduce a bad situation by adding new fish. The quarantined fish may look really good. Hey, Kaler's Aquatics, welcome to the stream. So it's just, stocking is another one of the areas of new fish keeping research, in my opinion. I think it is something. HC Aqua says my new rack is mostly species only. That's probably the safest way to go. But there again, you can, buy some of the same species to bulk up your bloodlines from another seller and very easily end up in the same kind of situation again. Jay in Aquarium says, until I had to deal with Calaminaris worms, I was sloppy with quarantine. Always now. Yeah, it's always a bad situation. When you discover why you should be quarantining, you almost always end up in a situation where you wish the hell that you had quarantined. And that's not something that new fish keepers. Yeah, and JN says quarantine plants everything now. And it's the truth. Plants can bring in parasites. Plants can bring in pathogens. Plants can bring in diseases just as easily as fish can. So you going along quarantining all of your fish for 2 months and then you do the canary method and add those established fish to that tank and watch them for another 2 months, and all is well. But what you didn't realize was that a terrible pathogen came in on the plants that you ordered in and added to your tank. So this hobby is fraught with pitfalls, and it is my personal opinion that it is our best methodology to try our best to avoid all of those pitfalls that we can. Believe me, you're not going to avoid them all. Something's going to get you sooner or later if you keep fish long enough. If you are a fish keeper for any length of time, just take it to the bank. You're going to lose fish sooner or later. I mean, even if you lose fish just because they live out their entire lifetimes and die of old age, you're going to lose fish. Taylor's Aquatic says, I even set up a quarantine tank for marine inverts. Can't treat them, but I keep a canary fish with them. If it gets no symptoms in 6 weeks, the anemone shrimp crabs can go into the main tank. And that's excellent methodology, Kaylor. It doesn't mean that you're going to be 100% effective, but you're probably going to be 95% effective. And believe me, 95% effective is much better than rolling the dice, buying fish and just throwing them in there. And whatever happens, happens, you know. And we're getting off kind of on the topic of stocking, but it is terribly good advice, and it is germane to stocking to understand, for a new fish keeper to understand that the fish that they buy, wherever they get them from, if they go out and catch them out of the wild themselves. Fancy Tail Aquatics had an experience with plants bringing in mayfly nymphs. That was a bad...
Mayflies?
Yeah, mayflies have killed.
Yeah, they have those huge larvae.
Yep. And they're deadly. And there are all kinds of water beetles and things like those. You can bring in hydras. You can bring in all kinds of critters that are capable of wiping out a whole tank full of outrageously expensive fish. You know, some new fish species hits. Lumpy Dog says, leak testing, my new to me used 90-gallon tank. Grats on getting a 90, Lumpy. Those are such a beautiful tank. 90 gallons is just about perfect. It's not gigantic, but it's large enough to really give you a stocking room. You can basically go wild stocking a 90-gallon tank. There's almost no fish that you can't buy. I mean, yes, if you go with gigantic large cichlids or, you know, I would stay away from buying parabas and putting them in there. But a 90-gallon is such a nice size. Really, 75 to 120 or 110, those are just really nice tank sizes, because you can look to buy very large schools of mini tetras. You could easily put 1,000 tetras in a 90-gallon tank. And you might have to work a little to keep the water quality good, but you could get away with that many. And you would have one awesome tank to look at. So good luck with the leak testing. A 90 is a beautiful enough tank size to me to make it worth resealing if you do end up with leaks. HC Aqua asks, does everyone cycle tanks before adding fish? I would advise And I have in this series advised that yes, you should cycle tanks, but Jay in Aquarium is right. If you use if you have sponge filters in active tanks that are the same pH or same TDS as the water that you're going to be using in the tank that you're wanting to break in, then yes, you can get away with squeezing out an old sponge filter into another tank and then running a new sponge filter in that tank, and you will get enough beneficial bacteria growth out of that to where the water can literally be cycled within a day or less. It's possible to have a bacteria bloom and the tank be fully cycled within a day. There are also lots of products that you can buy. Um, and Fancy Tales says to just use the sponge itself, and that's true as well. You can keep an extra sponge in one of your tanks and just grab that sponge and put it on an air stone in the new tank. And while you may have some die off, at least you've got a really well stocked sponge there for the new fish to start. So I think I'm going to end this series here. I think this is a series that a lot of people should really look at if they are new fish keepers. And while there are a few tips that have been given in this series was not meant to be an end all and be all for all the tips and tricks you need to become a better fish keeper if you've just started fish keeping. What I have tried to do in this series is point out areas of interest. Lumpy Dog was hoping to have the 90 ready for April Fools. I was going to make the new betta tank Fools video, stock it with just one betta. You might have a hard time finding just one betta in a 90. But you could put it in there even if it's leaking and do the video. Well, Phil, thank you. I'm not sure I'm worthy of such high praise, but I'm okay. I'm okay. I just feel a very close affinity for new fish keepers because I've been there and I've done that. We all have. And I just feel that it was incumbent on me to try my best to point out areas that I think that new fish keepers need to be aware of and need to research. And that doesn't mean that old hand fish keepers can't find some valuable information in there, but I just feel like for new fish keepers or people that are just getting their feet on the ground in the hobby, that these are areas where they can really help themselves by thinking about. This hobby isn't so much a run to the book all the time hobby. This hobby is a how you view things, what world view you've got of your fish tanks and their situations, how much you observe the fish that are in your tanks so that you can become used to what their quote normal behavior in your tank is, so that you can observe abnormal behavior and understand that it might be an issue that you need to look into, that maybe you need to start extra water testing, or maybe you need to look for a dead fish, or maybe you need to look for an aggression situation because suddenly a fish that you've been observing for 5 months is suddenly behaving differently than what you're used to. And that can only be a product of your observation in your tank. It's not something that I can teach. It's not something that I can tell you, but we can give you tips. We can offer ways to recognize that if that fish that you've been watching for 6 months swim around peacefully in the tank is suddenly starting to flick itself against rocks or against gravel or against plants, it may very well be a sign that that fish has some parasite, maybe the Calamaneris worms that were talked about earlier, or some issue that that fish is suddenly dealing with that either hasn't presented itself for observation yet, or you have not looked closely enough to Phil says, I'm a less than successful long-time fish keeper. Sometimes a glass box with water keeper, but I keep chipping away at it with your help and Lumpy's help. Thanks again, you guys. And that's all we can do is try to help each other. And that's the genesis for me doing this little short series, is so that others can offer tips from their vast pool of experience, and new fish keepers could ask questions in the thread, the chat threads, and to try to give new fish keepers a way to look at what they're doing that's different from their normal way of doing things, so that they recognize that, hey, maybe I need to pay attention to what kind of substrate I'm putting in this tank, rather than just buying something and throwing it in there and not understanding how it affects the, hey, I need to look at my stocking differently. Instead of just buying something and throwing it in the tank, I need to be aware of what I've bought and what its requirements are and whether it's going to fit with what I've already got in my tank. So I'm going to leave this series here. Fancy Tail Aquatics says, Dwayne, are you located close to Louisville, Kentucky? I thought I saw you at a fish club here. I am just north across the river in Indiana, and my wife and I both did go to the Rusty Wessels Club in Louisville. We went and caught Rachel O'Leary's talk, and we joined the club. But my experience was less than happy, let's say, and we've ended up just letting that. I'm sorry that we don't go. It just ended up being kind of a bad experience for both of us. And there were a lot of different reasons, and not all of them were political. Rusty Wessel has been an idol of mine for 25, 35 years. I've followed his exploits in the Button Barsh and in magazines throughout the years, because he was collecting in Central America and South America, and I have no end of respect for Rusty, but it just ended up not working out for us very well for a number of reasons, and so I no longer go to meetings. We're no longer members, but that doesn't mean that Fancy Tail Aquatics should not be a member, or that any of you in any of these chats should not be members of your local club. Sometimes I rub people wrong. I can't imagine why. But sometimes I'm kind of opinionated, and my mouth gets ahead of my brain sometimes, and I say things and do things that tick people off, and that's part of it. But there are other parts of it as well. But I really prefer not to go into that in any depth. Um, you can back channel me, and I'll be glad to talk as much as you want. But right now, I just prefer this. This whole series is basically for new fish keepers and for old hand fish keepers to give those people um, a helping hand up. But Fancy Tail Aquatics, I would be more than happy to make connections with you. Um, there are a lot of great fish keepers in Louisville. I know several of them, and I've met fish keepers from all over Indiana as well. And there are some phenomenal people in the hobby. That's one thing that new fish keepers do not know or understand, that there's probably someone on your street that keeps exactly the same kind of fish that you do and has been doing it for 40 years in their basement and no one knows about it. But I'm not sure, Fancy Tail. Gonna have to see about that. All right, guys, I'm gonna shut this down. I hope this series has been valuable in some way to someone. My target audience is new fish keepers. So you bought a fish tank, people that are suddenly find themselves in the hobby or have worked their way into the hobby and are at a loss. So I would hope that at some point that someone in that grouping finds this useful. And I hope you guys have a great weekend and good luck with your fish keeping. I'll do something different next week. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I know I need to start putting out more content. I'm going through some physical therapy right now from this shoulder, which has caused me no ends of trouble. So it's kind of deadened my desire to do. Good luck, guys, and have a good rest of your weekend.